So this is where I'm at the beginning of this video with the table, and this is basically ready for clear coat. There's really not much more I'm going to do to this before I clear coat it. Like I said in the last video, the second video is mostly going to detail how I shaped the legs for this. If you remember, the legs started off as a 2-inch square walnut, and there was a lot of tapering involved to get this kind of sleek, streamlined look to the entire table. The third video will mostly entail how I made the drawer and finishing up the top as well as the clear coat. And the drawer, it's going to be a whole video because I'm going to show you how I did dovetails on this. And I don't believe this drawer is getting a knob. I think it's staying this way because there's enough of a lip underneath that you can pull it out without a problem. And it will kind of, once again, keep that whole kind of streamlined look going on, which is what the customer was looking for. So once I had this table all together, I made some marks down from the apron, so I made sure I didn't taper it above the apron because then it wouldn't match flush where the apron is, as well as I came up about 6 inches from the bottom and I marked the inside with little tick marks at the bottom so I knew which sides to taper, because once it all comes apart it can get a little confusing, and tapered legs are usually done on the inside edges and the outside edge is square. So all I did was I have an angled piece of plywood that I use for multiple projects. I screwed it to the table of my radial arm saw, and then just so I got about the rough angle, and then you could see I could cut off all of those pieces. Once I had that done, I could flip it and then cut the exact same angle on the other edge. And that would give me my initial taper that I'd work off the rest of the time. So the nice thing about the radial arm saw is I could hold that all there while I'm doing it, and you could see that the outside edges aren't tapered and that inside edge is. Then I went through and I started rounding over the legs. So this is kind of what it looks like after rounding over and before. So this was, I did most of this with hand planes. I would just go over and create a flat spot on top of all of my corners, and then I would just feather that flat edge over to the side using a series of planes. Now I am working off of a photo for this piece, so I would intermittently send photos to the customer just to make sure we were staying on the same page. For pieces like this where it's there's a little more design involved, it's not just a basic cabinet, I like to do that just because if you go too far with the legs, there's really no going back. So you can see I'm creating that flat portion on the top and then just rounding it over just to start making that leg look more, it wasn't necessarily a circle, it was more like an oval. You can see I'm just flipping it around, and this is pretty quick work on all of the legs. So in between that, I went through and finished up the bottom edges of all of the aprons. So I just used a draw knife to do this because it leaves a nice natural edge on the wood. And then I did that for the top as well. I got most of the bark off just with a draw knife, cleaned up those edges. I'll go back and sand these as well, but for the initial cleanup, it's really easy work with a draw knife. And I did this at the same time as the aprons, just so that when I put it back together and see how everything looks, I have the aprons at their final depth. So I sent over an initial photo of those legs, and we agreed that they should be done more. And then I went through and I really took these down so they became much more slender and much sleeker. So what I'm doing is I have a point on the top side of the leg as well as the back side of the leg, and I'm kind of keeping that angle in place and then rounding over the edges. I'm keeping the top part pretty much untouched except for the front edge. I'll go all the way to the top. But you can see I just have it on my table. I'm just using those planes once again to round over those pieces. This is really mostly done by eye. I'm using my sight lines to make sure that it stays the same as before, and then I'm just going through with the series of planes, and because the ones that fit in your hand versus the one that you hold with the handle, they all kind of handle the material a little bit differently.
and then I went through and I sanded them just to kind of get a look at what I was dealing with at this point. You can see how towards the top there is a slight round over on all the corners, but it's not nearly as severe as the bottom. You could also see in the front it's curved a little bit, so the shape of the legs itself almost looks like a saber. It has a little bit of a curve to it. You can also see in the front and the back I do have it comes to a point, almost an arch, and that arch was the line I followed. You can see really well from this angle how on the top there's an arch. It's rounded over to the back side, which also has an arch. So that was basically what I was doing. I was creating that one pointed part in the middle and then rounding over to meet on either edge. So once I had those legs pretty much done, there was a little more shaping off camera to get those perfect. I went through and I'm going to be putting some dovetails in my aprons. In order to, there's going to be a drawer in this. In order to get that, I wanted to glue this all together in one solid piece, so I didn't have to worry about it being unsquare or parts not aligning. And then I would cut the drawer out afterwards. But since the drawer is taking up such a large surface area in the front of the cabinet, I wanted to have two rails going from the back to the front to keep everything square. I decided to make those rails with dovetails so that they can never pull out. The tail will keep them in place. I usually do dados for stuff like this, but in this circumstance it just felt stronger to make dovetails. So you can see I'm just doing 2 dados in this, and because I have one live edge I had to keep switching my fence back and forth on my table saw in order to cut those dados symmetrical. And then once I did that, I just tilted my blade. This is about a 10-degree tilt, and I could cut 2 angles on either side. Now half of this I have to do by hand because, like I said, since it's live edge I can't flip it on my miter gauge. I can only cut it going one way. If it was square on both edges, you could just flip it and make the same cuts. So I can only get one edge. You can see I'm just going to use a sharp knife in order to finish up the other side. With a chisel I could go through and just chisel out that little piece of material in order to get that dovetail. So the front edge of the dovetail is 3/4 of an inch, and then it tapers to 1/2 of an inch in the back. And once again, you can see this is pretty quick work with a sharp chisel to even out that dovetail. So that's what it's going to look like when it's finished. So then I took a piece of poplar and I actually cut a dovetail, and there is some work to be done on these, but you'll see I make a test piece and then I test that piece out in the dovetails, and I'll clean up the spots that I missed. So I had to have this a little bit of a 3/4 shim on my tenoning jig. You can see I have that clamped in place in order to cut these dovetails, because otherwise the blade would have hit the fence. So that once again is just a little 10-degree cut, and I used my tenoning jig to cut that with a shim so that it was kicked off enough from the blade in order to actually make the cut. And then you could see with everything clamped in place on my workbench, I could take that test piece and clean out that dovetail until it fits nicely. Once I had that, I clamped the whole thing together, and then I could take a final measurement for the width of these. They ended up being the same, which was a good sign, and then I could final cut 2 pieces. I could have used the original, but this is poplar, so even though it's a hardwood, it's not as dense as other woods, so it will dent a little bit. Not as much as pine, but it will dent a little bit. So when I was testing it out and hammering in place, I messed up the dovetail a little bit, so I just cut new pieces. And then I could finally glue this whole thing together once I had those done. As you can see, it's just a matter of getting glue in all of those mortise holes, all those tenons. The nice thing about the haunches and the dovetails and the tenons is there's so much glue surface area for this. So once it was together, everything's really strong because it's going to be holding up a fairly heavy top. And like I said, it's going to have a very large chunk missing from the front of the cabinet. So I could get one edge in place, kind of I'm referencing my tabletop, which is flat, to keep the top side flat, because if the top doesn't glue up flat, then your top you put on it won't be flat either. And then once I had that in place, I could put the dovetail pieces in. Now these were a tight fit, so you'll see as I start to hammer, the strap clamps just weren't strong enough to hold everything together. So I ended up adding 2 clamps to the legs in front like this, and then also once I had those dovetails in, I added 2 going the other direction and let this whole thing dry. So this is kind of the natural stopping point for this, and then next week the video might be a little bit longer because there's some more footage to do with the drawer, but it wouldn't really fit into this video.